Hello and welcome to the Revived podcast. I guess that's where we're going to start. Hopefully you've been appreciating the first two episodes. I've been testing some things out, and if you notice some maybe glitchy sounds in the last episode, just move past that. I tried some sort of editing. I didn't love it, so I'm going to try something new this episode. Got some audio levels fixed, and so now we seem to be cruising, and we're doing really great. And so thank you for sticking with us. We are now on YouTube and Spotify, and honestly, a lot of different platforms as well. But those are the two big video ones, honestly, the most popular. And so go ahead and share this with everybody, letting them know that we're on both, and that would be greatly appreciated. Subscribers, I guess I have three. Well, let's see here. I might have more than three at the time of this recording. I have three, but that's actually kind of amazing. I'm surprised. So the three of you that subscribe to YouTube, I applaud you, and I should give you all a free gift. What do you think? If you think you deserve a free gift, go ahead and DM me. Let me know what your free gift should be, and I'll decide if I get it for you. If I don't be sad. I'm on budgets, small budgets, because it's still baby season. Yeah, little baby update. Things are going really well. The only thing going on right now is figuring out sleepless nights. Like the other day, actually, this is kind of a funny story. We'll start off with a funny story to engage the audience and just bring you guys into my life. So the other day, me and my wife, we went to bed. I started doing some bottle feedings to have kind of get longer stretches for either spouse and taking shifts, as some would say. But then we woke up in the morning, but there was a grand problem. We ran out of coffee. So my wife did her best to make the coffee that we had from what we had, and it was subpar. But I didn't get to drink it till about maybe an hour and a half later. So I love super fresh coffee. So I had this coffee, and it was about an hour and a half later. It was not fresh, and I drank it, and I'm like, this is the most subpar cup of coffee ever. I've only had about half of it, but I kid you not. The rest of the day, me and my wife were just on the struggle bus, and I don't know if it was attributed to like, hey, like struggling with sleep, but we didn't start our day with the coffee because we eventually got coffee. Went to Starbucks and got coffee, but we were just on the struggle bus all day long. Like I couldn't pull my head out of a funk. It was just seeming like a gloomy day. I'm like, I can't open my eyes. I'm just like, my brain is gone. I'm just like zombie, and it was rough. My wife was the same way, and I just felt so bad for my kids. Like, bet you can relate with me here. And sometimes you get a little bit more snappier or quick to just do things or say things, or you just let things go and play out, and you're like, I should have intervened because I knew she was gonna fall flat on our face doing that. And it's just like, what do you do when you're just like sleep deprived and got nothing else going for you? The coffee ain't working, and but sometimes that's just life. But that is like only one day out of many of having kids, and the many is usually really great. Then every once in a while you have these kind of little harder days. Hey, but without the harder days, the other days they don't seem so easy. Wait, if you do something hard, the rest seems easy. So that's pretty great, and I love that. So that's where we're at. We're just adjusting to sleep. It's joyful having three kids. It's fun to figure out and enjoy, and I wouldn't change it for anything. So it's absolutely wonderful. Well, that is our little story to get us going today. But like I said, we are starting. Actually, I don't know if I said this already, but welcome to probably officially take one, or episode one, podcast series one, season two, whatever you want to call it, Sermon on the Mount, or as Luke would say it, Sermon on the Plain. So our starting point, and just to let you know, I'm going to go from here to here because this is where I got my notes, down here. Follow me, down here. So this is where I got my notes, and I'll be reading you some notes. But I've been, over the last couple of weeks, I've been doing a lot of study, in-depth study onto Matthew and Luke, because as we previously talked about, the Sermon on the Mount is written in both of them. Matthew calls it the Sermon on the Mount. Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain. And that's kind of our starting point here. One is in Matthew 5. And did I not write down? Wow, I did not write down where in Luke this was for you. I am sorry. Wow, I think it's in Luke 6. You know what? I got it about right here. Let's look it up. Sorry, bear with me, but I want to make sure I give you the correct spot. Okay, Matthew 5 for sure. And Matthew, Mark, Luke. Wow, flipping pages, getting all stuck together. See, I'm not going to cut this part. This is the most fun part of my podcast, is having you guys just wait and listen to the paper. Just, ooh, is he going to get there? Oh, I hope so. Crowds follow. Yes, it's in the 6th chapter. See, I was right. 5, 6. Hey, it makes sense. One comes first and then the other. Technically, that is also true. Matthew was written before Luke was. Okay, let's go ahead and give you guys some notes really quick. So Matthew was mostly written to He was written from, like, the eyewitness of Matthew the disciple. It was written to a Jewish audience. Luke, he was a physician, and he wrote mostly to a Gentile audience. So now this helps me understand why there are discrepancies. So if you read Matthew, you'll notice there's so much more there than there is in Luke. But this helps. So a little background on Luke here. So he was not an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, but he meticulously researched the gospel by interviewing eyewitnesses. He was a well-educated writer, proficient in Greek, and likely a Gentile, or as some would say, a Hellenized Jew. So don't get caught up on that. Just move forward. A little bit on Matthew. If you don't know about him, he was a Jewish tax collector, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. And when he wrote this, it was really focused on that he had the knowledge of, like, Hebrew scripture. So it was really to Jewish people with a lot of, like, background into, like, what the Jews would understand. So now this is good, because when we read here in just a second how the Sermon on the Mount starts off, you'll notice that Jesus, he addresses a certain audience. And with the two differences about who wrote it, it's really going to stand out about kind of which one you should tackle for which audience. And I never thought about this before. So if you look at it, a lot of pastors just say, hey, we're going to go through, like, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 5, and it's great because that's where all the content is. Everyone kind of passes up Luke. Like, I went to church my whole life, grew up in church. I went to, like, there's probably like 10 Sundays I probably never went to church in my life, or youth group and all that. I've never heard someone mention Luke 6 has the Sermon on the Mount. And I always wondered why. But I think after my research, Matthew 5 seems to have a lot more than Luke 6. But Luke 6 was written mostly to Gentiles. So here's kind of a starting point that I would like to give you a thought, an overarching view and thought. Actually, before I give you my overarching thought, let me give you a little story to help draw you in. So if you're a football fan or a sports fan, pick your favorite sports team, and you're going to try to convince somebody, hey, you should be a fan of my team, or you should get bought in, you should be drawn in. What are you going to do? How are you going to teach that person? So probably what you're first going to do, so say this person is like, hey, I don't really know much about sports, but I want to get into a team, sell me on an idea. The first thing you're probably going to do is, I'm a Steelers fan for football, and I might be like, hey, here's our colors. We're located in Pittsburgh. Here's our stadium. Here's some of our history. Kind of these big overarching themes to draw them in, to be like, hey, it's a great atmosphere. It's a great environment. If you love, like, here's all these, like, big building blocks of the team. And does it sound interesting to you? Does it sound like a team you can get behind? And if so, they get drawn in and they're like, sweet, sounds great, I'm in. And so they loved my big building blocks, but now I get to give them the little fine details of everything else. Like, hey, like, did you know the steel curtain was a thing? The Immaculate Reception was a thing. At the end of the fourth quarter, this thing that started this, not the end of the fourth quarter, during the fourth quarter for, like, defensive, like, umph and everything, they play the song Renegade. And then that just spirals into some amazing defensive plays. And then you start giving them all these details, like, once you're in, here's all these things going on. So you would probably do that for a lot of different sports teams, a lot of different products. Like, hey, like, here, you like Toyota trucks, you like Ford trucks, you like Ram trucks, you like computers, you like software, you like applications, you like houses, you like anything. Pick anything that you're going to try to sell somebody on. You never give them the details up front. You always kind of give them, here's what we got, and then we get down into the nitty gritty. Because if you give them nitty gritty without really giving them an overview of what's happening, they're going to get lost and they're going to get confused, and you'll be like, what's going on? Like, why? I need help understanding. So this is where I would see our comparison with Luke and Matthew. So since Luke was written mostly to a Gentile audience, the focus is a little bit different. It's focusing, I would say, if you are someone who doesn't really know who Jesus is, the best place to start with the Sermon on the Mount is in Luke. Because that was written mostly to a Gentile audience who doesn't have all this background of Jewish knowledge or becoming a disciple of Jesus. But in Matthew, I would say, once you're a disciple or a follower of Jesus, start diving into the Matthew side of things, because it's a lot more spiritually heavy. And this is where you can really figure out that discipleship track a little bit more. So that is kind of what I've noticed from a little comparison here. Let me go ahead and tell you this. So it's interesting to think about, isn't it? I couldn't say that's, like, for sure right or wrong. It's just a view and an opinion and kind of something that I'm grasping as I'm studying these two. And you'll notice it actually as we go through the actual content. So, but let me tell you something really quick. So let's go into Luke. And he starts like this. So the crowds are following Jesus. And then the Beatitudes from Luke 6, verse 20 says, Then Jesus turned to his disciples and said, Blessed are you who are poor, for the kingdom of God is yours. And so it starts off, then Jesus turned to his disciples and said. And so from an eyewitness account, the eyewitness claims that Jesus turned to his disciples. Interesting. All right, let's go over to Matthew. Oh my gosh. Too many bookmarks. Sermon on the Mount. So the crowds gathered, just as they did in Luke, but I forgot to read you that part. But it says here, so his disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. So the thing that is really standing out here is I have always thought the Sermon on the Mount was directed toward the crowds. The crowds were definitely there. The crowds heard the message, but I don't think the crowds were the direct audience based off what we're reading here. It seems, and also from in-depth study, that the direct audience of this was the disciples. So think about this. If you're not a disciple of Jesus, how much of this is going to make sense to you, or how much of this is going to stand out? You know, it's like you're going to get to know who Jesus is, but there's another verse in here. I probably should have looked this someone up before. Just like until you like believe, there's some things that like I think God just reveals to you as a believer, and that like you get an insight into. And I think that's what happens here. So when you become a follower of Jesus, these stories and these examples and everything that Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount actually become clearer to you. Because if you're not a follower, and some of this might be like, what the heck does that mean? Like pearls before swine, and why do I care about anger and adultery and all that stuff? But then once you start becoming a follower of Jesus and he starts teaching you things, you're like, oh, I get it now. It makes sense to me. So the Beatitudes is how Jesus starts it off. Trying to figure out where the best to go from here. There. Let's consult my notes. Boop. And so here we go. So I took some notes, and I'm going to kind of read this as like the disciple crowd and everything. So why would we start with Luke's account? Well, it's more grounded and more accessible. It's shorter and simpler. And so there is a social emphasis and there's a direct approach. You'll notice I said God says in the Beatitudes, God blesses you who are poor. And then Matthew says, blessed are those. There's like a little bit of a language difference there. It's a lot simpler. It's easier to understand. So think about it, like a Gentile doesn't know who Jesus is. And so they need like practical information. And I think Luke does a very good job of just breaking this down very simply and what's like important. And that's going to draw someone in to get to know who Jesus is. And then once they know who Jesus is, then they're going to be able to say, hey, let me go read some more about this sermon and some other things. Because you'll notice the Beatitudes goes from, in the Sermon on the Mount, it goes to the Beatitudes in Luke over to love your enemies. And then in Matthew 5, it goes to the Beatitudes, salt and light, teaching about the law, teaching about anger, teaching about adultery, teaching about divorce, teaching about vows, teaching about revenge, and then it goes love for enemies. So for some reason, Luke didn't think all those other things were important to throw into there right away. Luke also puts something in here. He has like 4 sorrows. Yeah, 4 sorrows. Matthew doesn't cover 4 sorrows. So why is it important that Luke put in these 4 sorrows? We'll get there one thing at a time. Sermon on the Mount is a very long sermon, but in order to have a good understanding of going forward, we need to start now with a really solid base. So in Matthew's account, it's a lot more of deeper spiritual insights, as we discussed already. It's about inward transformation, the valuable for someone who is following Jesus and wanting to grow in their faith. And there's a heavy discipleship focus. And there's also a good kingdom perspective. It provides a fuller version of the kingdom of heaven, showing its spiritual, eternal dimension. So that's pretty cool. So Luke, if we use what we're kind of going to do here is we're going to use kind of like Luke as the starting point, and Matthew has a next step based off of this information. So Luke, we're going to be introducing Jesus through the lens of someone who meets their immediate needs and turns their world's values like upside down. So I think that's why like he goes like, hey, we're going to go love your enemies. Like that's a shocking idea. Why would someone teach that? You know, because if you just went straight to salt and light and divorce and vows, people would be like, okay, you kind of lost me there. But Luke goes like, hey, here's some Beatitudes that are very interesting. Here's some sorrows. Love your enemies. Don't judge others. Tree and its fruit. Solid foundation. Actually, those are all of it. And then it goes into the Roman officer. So those are like, that's what Luke decided. Like these are the introductory concepts that are just going to be like, this is going to draw someone in to get to know who Jesus is. And then they're going to want to know more, which I think is awesome. Matthew, as we're going to use that as the next step, I'm kind of deciding if we're just going to go through Luke's account and then Matthew's account, or if we're going to kind of do them side by side. I've yet to fully decide that, but we'll figure it out as we get going. But Matthew, as the next step, says once you follow Jesus, Matthew's account guides us into a deeper relationship with him, focusing on who we're becoming as we live out the kingdom values. And so this is actually a cool note that I found. Like, this approach mirrors how Jesus met people where they were, but always called them to something greater. Luke gives the first invitation, and Matthew provides the map for the journey. Isn't that really cool? See, I wish more people, more churches taught this, because I think we have a really hard time, like, really drawing people into who is Jesus and giving them good resources. Most of the time, we say, hey, here, non-Christian, non-believer, here's the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. This is what I've always done. But I get lost. Excuse me. And I don't want people to get lost trying to get to know who Jesus is. And so I think this is fantastic now that there is a resource. It's like, hey, draw them in with these key concepts. And then once you get these key concepts, if they want to take the journey further, go over to Matthew. And so we'll be we'll be comparing both of these on that spectrum. Invitation and then map for journey. That's pretty sweet. So let's go ahead and get going here with, well, let's see here. Do I want to leave you guys hanging, or do I want to give you a little bit of taste of what's going on? Well, let's go ahead and switch gears here and kind of just leave this kind of like with a little bit of a practical application for you. So think about in your life. Yeah, here we go. Think about in your life who out there knows Jesus and who doesn't know Jesus. Think about how you always approached presenting the gospel to them and what it means to follow Jesus. Have we always preached and taught, hey, you got to just believe in Jesus, place your salvation, like ask him, Jesus, into your heart, get baptized, and boom, that's it? Or do we teach more of like, hey, this is who Jesus is by the way that he lives, and if you want this and become his disciple, that means you're going to follow these teachings and you're going to want to discover and journey more into it. So think about those two people, the people that know Jesus, the people that don't. How best to go about inviting them in? So here at Revived, we say, hey, we like reclaim and redefine. We reclaim our identity as who we are as children of God. We are fallen from him. Jesus came back, died on the cross, raised from the dead, killed all our sins, buried them, or whatever. Now we're reconnected back to the Father. And so we are to reclaim our identity is to be a child, like realize that we are children of God. And then reclaim and redefine your personal culture. That's what we like to say here. And that in the sense of like culture says like your culture is like your world around you. And then there's like the greater culture, but that has to get redefined once you become a disciple. And the Sermon on the Mount is so intricate into what that actually looks like loving your enemies. That's the first part that Luke jumps into. That is a very upside down kingdom thinking. It's honestly in God's kingdom, it's probably right side up. In our world, we call it upside down because who wants to naturally just love their enemies? Nobody. But that's a part of redefining your culture. Now you have to redefine that part of your life. And how does that play out in the world around you? So at Revive, we say reclaim and redefine. So for those two people in your mind, people who know Jesus and people who don't, how does this apply to them? For the people who know Jesus and want to take that further next step in their faith, I would encourage us to walk through the book of Matthew, and as we'll be doing in this podcast, and teaching them, hey, this is what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. And then challenging those people to be like, hey, I see this in your life. Maybe we'll have an episode about how to confront somebody or present stuff, because I honestly don't know the best way to do this. But here's some things in your life. I encourage you to, like, this is what being a disciple and follower of Jesus means. Like, how are you submitting your life to what the word says and not what the culture says, the church says, the podcast says? Like, what does Jesus' actually, like, words say? And are you submitting your life to that way of life? For your unbeliever friend, I would say, hey, start presenting them the book of Luke. Start saying, hey, here's Jesus, and here's these ideas like that he really is behind, and that are very just counter-cultural, counter-worldly. And these are enough to draw you in. And I find that very interesting that, like, Luke, he was a physician, so he's a smart guy, knew what was going on in the culture, is a Gentile, but he picked only a few select passages that he thinks would deem, like, that can bring people in. And I don't think he excluded any that should have been in here, and I don't think he included too much. I think these are the perfect stories. And we're going to not the stories. These are like love your enemies, judge others, symbolisms, I guess, or like, hey, this is who Jesus is. I don't know that word. You probably do listening to this and you're correcting me in your mind right now, but that's okay. But we need to learn how to articulate this so that when someone asks, we can start giving, instead of the whole like, hey, here's my sports team, here's my brand, here's this thing that I love, and here's all these fine details, and getting someone lost and confused and be like, yo, I'm out because I just don't know what I'm doing. Give them the big blocks, give them the big picture, and this is enough to draw them in. There's going to be stuff like this is tantalizing to people who are like, so you're telling me that someone can love me even though they might not like me? And then I can do that to other people too? And I want to know more about that Jesus. I want to know more about the Jesus that says don't judge others. We live in such a culture of judging. So that is like, people are going to be sucked in by this idea of don't judge other people. Like, what does that even mean? How is that even possible? That's a big one for me, honestly. I like to judge people, but in my heart, and I don't say it out loud, but that's still wrong. We're going to teach people about building a solid foundation. Like, what does that mean? And honestly, let's close with this. Building a solid foundation is where I really focus in on my book coming out. I know, a little self-promo here, but when you build a solid foundation, especially in fatherhood, it really sets you up for success in every area of life. In fatherhood, that's my book specifically. I walk you through like these first few years of being a dad. I learned so many things that I wish I had given to me practically. I had some great examples in my life, especially my own dad, of what it looks like to walk out being a great dad. But I was missing kind of like, here's some like foundational like things that you can just hold to and live by and adjust your life to. And this will give you a strong platform to launch into the whole, I don't know what I'm doing. This is such an unknown world. So that is coming out. But even Luke here, he includes as building a solid foundation. So building a solid foundation isn't something that just comes natural to people. It doesn't come natural to me, being a Jesus follower for a long time. I bet it doesn't come natural to other people who don't follow Jesus. But I bet there's some people out there, and of course there's the outliers in the spectrum. So give me a break on that one. But you need to build a solid foundation. And when people are like, okay, cool, what's a solid foundation looks like? Then we can jump over to Matthew and be like, here's some more solid foundation. Isn't that cool? So like, we're going to go ahead and do this. We're going to work through Luke, and then we're going to work through Matthew, and we're going to walk through what it's like to take, we're going to have a friend out here. We're not going to, of our two examples I gave earlier, no offense, we're going to drop the guy who knows Jesus because he can pick up on Matthew, but we're going to pretend we have a friend, and our friend doesn't know who Jesus is. And so we're going to walk through the Beatitudes according to Luke, and then we'll walk through the Sermon on the Mount, or Sermon on the Plain according to Luke, and then we'll dive over into Matthew. So I hope you're ready for a fun adventure. This is where we're going, and I hope you learned something new today. Thank you for joining us on the podcast episode today. I really appreciate all the support and everything that everyone is giving me. And yeah, so I really like to just talk to you. So hopefully there's not too many oohs or ahs or like, where's he going with this? Or looking at his notes too much and not looking at the camera enough, looking at the Bible enough. I really prioritize just a fluid conversation like you're talking to Steven in the basement. That's where I am if you didn't know that. So thank you for joining us today on the Revived Podcast, teaching you how to reclaim and redefine your life. Maybe I can clean that up and make it sound more pretty. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to breaking down Luke, breaking down Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, and giving us actual tools to articulate this is who Jesus is, and helping people grow in their journey of discipleship and faith in Jesus.